So yeah, when I think of regeneration, literally the term, a return to Genesis, so to speak. A return to Genesis was, reclaiming what we once had, in some sense. That's one way I think of it. Another way I think of it, I think, in a conversation about building a new economy for the information age, I'm inclined to expand the conversation to considering collective intelligence. And collective intelligence is a very, I think, when I think of regeneration, I think of collective intelligence as, collective intelligence is a very broad term, and it definitely begs a longer conversation. But let me just describe what collective intelligence is. And there's 3 examples I can give. One form of collective intelligence is very natural. So we think of a beehive, right? In a beehive, if a beehive decides it wants to move to a new location, let's say that there's something wrong with the tree it's mounted in, what will happen is that the individual agents of that beehive, the bees, will disperse from the hive, and they'll go all around the forest, and they'll seek out what they know makes for a new good location for the hive. And then all the bees will return to the beehive, and then they'll do this kind of dance on the surface of the beehive. They'll all kind of like, the thousands of them will be running over each other and mingling and buzzing their little antenna. And they do this process that we actually don't quite fully understand yet. But what scientists are realizing is that the process they're doing is very similar to what happens in a neural network. It's actually computing a decision based on many individual units. And so it's thinking literally like a brain. It's literally a hive mind, and that process will then it'll collapse to a decision will be made, and then that beehive will move. So it's actually a collective decision that's made without a centralized component. It wasn't the queen bee who made the decision, it was the collective who made the decision. So that's one form of collective intelligence, natural collective intelligence. Another form of collective intelligence would be like this. It's more like what we call the wisdom of crowds. So let's say, for example, let's imagine that we had a very large cow here on stage, very large cow. And there was a contest for everyone here that whoever can guess the weight of the cow will win a bottle of wine, right? And so we could take ballots, and everyone here could vote, and everyone out there can vote. And of course, we have a really diverse audience here. We have, we have computer scientists, we have entrepreneurs, we have children, we have, elderly, we have, maybe there's a homeless person in the back. We want all of their input. The point is we want a very diverse selection of a crowd where we have lots of different types of minds and individuals. And what research has found is if you compile everyone's answer for how much that cow weighs, the answer of the collective will be closer to the exact weight than if we had an expert, like we had a farmer in here or a cattle rancher. The crowd would have a more precise estimation of that weight than the farmer or than the expert. So that's another form of collective intelligence. So what I see is we live in a planet today with all these really large problems. And we have global warming and loss of biodiversity, economic problems. And these are really larger problems than we've ever dealt with as a collective before. No one individual can even hardly understand these problems, let alone get perfect solutions for them. So I see that collective intelligence is somewhat of a meta-solution to addressing these larger problems. If we're going to solve problems that are larger than we can even comprehend, we've got to raise our intelligence to a higher order to match those problems. So I see that achieving regeneration will include becoming something like a superorganism.
Nothing light about this.
Here's a positive framework for looking at where humanity's at today. If we draw a really large scope of time, we go back, say, tens of thousands of years or even hundreds of thousands of years. Humanity, it was very different here on Earth. And the human species at that time, was gathering in usually very, very smaller groups, tribal groups living in caves and doing their simple hunting and gathering. And this existed for, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We were a very distributed species. And, I'm sure we had problems then, but they weren't the same problems. And generally speaking, things probably felt a lot more harmonious than now. But then there was a significant shift. Around the time of agriculture, agriculture then allowed for humans to stop and not, do so much foraging and roaming around. And agriculture was then the impetus for what began, the early inklings of human civilization. And we began growing larger towns and then cities, and the population began to grow so much that that it reached a certain threshold that then required a significant change in society. There's a term called Dunbar's number, and it refers to when a human community grows up to about 100 or 120 people, or beyond that. We can't track it all then. As an individual, I can't track what 120 people or 200 or 20,000 or 20 million people are up to. It's impossible. And so we actually required the development of more centralized systems of control in order to bootstrap this thing called society. And we created, things like banks and governance and the police force, because it was necessary to scale our population. So we've been in that phase now for roughly the last, 10,000 years or so of growing human civilization. We require decentralized mechanisms to do that. But then gradually, over the last few hundred years, beginning with advents like the printing press and then the internet, we're now seeing signs of coming around the curve again, and developing technologies that'll help us come back to more of a tribal way of being, and a distributed way of being, where we can now remove those centralized controls. But I think this is all necessary. I think we're right on time, actually. I think that we needed to go through this phase. It's been a very challenging phase of a lot of centralized control, and in order to scale that population, because I think it's part of the telos, or the intention of the planet as a whole. As if we think of the planet as an organism in itself, it needs to grow the human population. If the human population is something like the elements for a global superbrain or what have you, we need numbers. We need to scale the population, and so it was required to have this period of centralizing elements. But now we're just seeing the phase of coming out of that. So I think we're right on time. And this insight came to me having been involved with the cryptocurrency industry for the last 7 years, because I didn't understand economics before that. Once I got into blockchain, it really began to change my mind around understanding that economic systems and financial systems are much more malleable than I ever thought before. And in the context of what you were saying about hive mind and how Twitter already does show some degree of collective intelligence there. But I think to deepen understanding there, also understand that economics is something like a framework for a malleable framework for creating the conditions by which different types of collective intelligence may be produced. And it's similar to natural evolution as well. In the philosophy of biological evolution, we can see that anytime there's a significant shift of a very significant shift of life forms, like photosynthesis, for example, when that happens in nature, there's simultaneously a significant change in the way that information is both stored and transferred in biology. And so I think, again, that's how blockchain, distributed ledger technology in the scope of economics can in some ways serve this as a tool we have now to collectively co-create and experiment with new ways of transferring and storing value exchange in order to really recreate something on the order of natural evolution.
Love it.
Were you saying that you're observing that all these technological solutions may not work because of an underlying psychology? Is that what you're saying? Yes. I'm really glad you asked this question. I think about this a lot, and I have a lot to say about it. I wasn't planning on talking about it tonight, but yeah, I think it begins at the individual level. And I think it also has one way. There might be more. There's probably more than one way, but one way too is really considering the narrative we're telling ourselves, both as individuals and as a collective. We're really focused a lot on right now, because right now has a lot of our attention. But I think it would serve us well to really consider, the full scope of the human story, and that humanity has come a long, long, long way, and we've been through a lot of challenging crises in our deeper past that I think we could potentially be carrying still in the genetic memory of our DNA. And that's just not a woo-woo idea. There's a scientific lab in Japan has done some experiments with mice that actually shows that memory is carried through DNA. It's my perspective, and this is somewhat of a hypothesis. There's not a whole lot of data backing it up, but it's my perspective that the current global crisis we're facing could in fact really be somewhat generated by our collective unconscious in order to try to re-emerge these collective emotions we're feeling from other periods in our deep history where we faced similar crises before. Yeah. And so, from a psychological perspective, if you look at an individual, if you have an individual human being who has a traumatic event happen in their youth, and they go through their life without fully remembering or resolving and integrating that traumatic event, what's going to happen with that individual? How are they going to live? From a psychological perspective, they will recreate the conditions of that initial trauma subconsciously into their environment in order to reintegrate the initial event. I think it's open for consideration that that's what's happening for humanity now, that we're recreating a series of global crises so we can push up against it. I'm still optimistic.
And heal.
I'm still optimistic. I think we will push up against it. I think we're going to have to feel some real crisis, and that's part of it. Although I don't think it also dismisses the necessary technologies and systems that will also need to be created for long-term sustainable change.
Yeah.